On the May 20th episode of the Script Notes podcast, the subject turned to superhero movies. While joking around with guests about difficult-to-adapt characters, regular co-host Craig Mazin opined that Marvel character the She-Hulk would more accurately be called Slut-Hulk, and that furthermore her being depicted as sexually attractive, to him, meant that either she or her creation were implicitly sexist. Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. Anyway, while Mazin's Slut-Hulk jab and unique interpretation of the concept of sexism was certainly the most incendiary part, what caught a lot more flack was the subsequent commentary from screenwriter David Goyer, who wondered aloud about whether or not a man had created She-Hulk and theorized that they might have done so in order to give male Hulk fans a fantasy object by creating a green porn star that only the Hulk could Setting aside for a moment the general unpleasantness of pretty much this entire display, and the amusing fact that a screenwriter who's only really known for making movies out of comic books doesn't actually seem to know them very well, the resulting internet blow-up did end up touching off an interesting discussion about the representations of female characters, and in particular, female sexuality in mainstream comics. And also an excuse for the internet to gang up on David Goyer, but hey, you can do two fun things at once. So, some background. In the 70s, Marvel had found success by licensing characters like the Hulk and Spider-Man for network TV shows, but when the Bionic Woman, a female starring spin-off of the $6 Million Man, became a huge hit, they started to get wary. According to their TV contracts, the producers owned everything from Marvel TV shows but the original characters themselves, meaning that if they were to create similar gender-flipped spin-offs, they could potentially cut Marvel out of the picture entirely. Thus, even though he'd famously been against spin-off characters in the past, Stan Lee himself sprang into action, co-creating the quote-unquote original character, the Savage She-Hulk. Other Marvel talents took up the job of hammering out Spider-Woman. The story: Jennifer Walters is a female lawyer who requires a blood transfusion after being injured in a gangland shooting. The only available compatible donor turns out to be her cousin, Dr. Bruce Banner, aka the Incredible Hulk, whose gamma-irradiated blood gives her an augmented version of his affliction. She still gets big and green, and while not as strong or invulnerable as the Hulk, Jennifer eventually doesn't lose any of her intelligence, personality, or awareness and can transform back and forth at will. So basically, as long as you don't mind being bright green when you morph into a physically ideal Amazonian supermodel, there's really not much downside to being the She-Hulk. Hell, in most versions, she hardly ever even bothers to change back into a human. I mean, why would she? Now, let's be clear. You can chalk up the rationale for why Bruce Banner hulks out into an ogre while his cousin just turns into a different version of sexy to regular old simple comic book marketing. The presumed audience was boys, so if you're gonna put a lady on every cover, she'd better be attractive. I don't know if that's sexist, but it is cynical. Cheap magazines marketed to kids and teenagers weren't bastions of social progressivism. Shocker. But, however accidentally, the She-Hulk setup actually wound up being another of Marvel's quietly subversive creations, and yes, also sort of progressive and, after a fashion, even feminist as a result. Here's the thing, the vast majority of formulas and tropes in classical myth-making that informs the Western storytelling tradition, power fantasy is split decisively on gendered lines. Male characters who get power can be destructive if they abuse it, but female characters with power will be destructive, period. Often as part of reinforcing a broader theme of female power being itself unnatural. And the first wave of power fantasies to manifest as superheroes weren't that much different. Superman is basically God, and it doesn't bring him much suffering at all. He never actually knew Krypton to miss it, and he hides his identity as much for his own benefit as Lois Lane's. Batman is sad, but not because he has to be Batman. He chooses to be Batman to make himself less sad. Only Wonder Woman is an outlier here, and that's because she was consciously set up to be so by the trio of radically progressive gender politics academics who created her in the first place. Now, whether intentionally or not, Marvel Comics' 1960s Silver Age heroes were largely subversions of the classical ideal of consequence-free male power fantasy. I have a technologically wonderful suit of armor that's also a medical device that keeps me from imminent death. I've acquired the power to show everyone I'm not the little nerd they picked on, but it costs me everyone I care about. And of course, I can become the ultimate specimen of masculine physical power, but it makes me a big dumb horrible monster. The Marvel heroes are male power fantasies, but they're also subversions of those same fantasies. If Bruce Banner turned into the Hulk with no negative consequences, he wouldn't be as interesting. Not because it's impossible to write a male character like that well, but because we've seen it a bunch of times before. But a woman in comics, hell, a woman in fiction who gets powers and doesn't really suffer for them, that is new. That is interesting. Especially when you consider that the power she gets, extreme physical strength, is traditionally thought of as a masculine ideal. And it quickly got more interesting when the comic storylines did away completely with the anger trigger plot device from her transformations, thus removing even a trace of the problematic PMS or hysteria metaphors that so often accompany empowered female characters. Even the broader notion of power as a burden is missing. Walters doesn't have to be She-Hulk, she chooses to be She-Hulk. Most of this, of course, wasn't originally deliberate. Nobody at Marvel sat down and said, hey guys, let's create a feminist icon. But once it came out, Marvel creators largely embraced it and ran with it. While her original solo series only lasted 25 issues, Possibly because they kept having her fight C-list villains like the Man-Elephant, she became a popular fixture of the Marvel Universe, becoming an Avenger and even a temporary member of the Fantastic Four. In 1989, the solo series was relaunched as The Sensational She-Hulk by writer-artist John Byrne with a new angle: self-awareness. Sensational would adopt an action-comedy tone wherein She-Hulk was conscious of being a fictional character living in a comic book universe, would get into arguments with her writers and editors, and even talk directly to the readers, while various plot points and one-off gags mocked the comic book censorship rules, and also the cheesy objectification of female characters that fans often demanded. She'd had a few more series since then, along with membership on teams like the Hulkbusters, the Lady Liberators, and the Mighty Avengers. So yeah, the She-Hulk. Not really a sexist character. Kinda the opposite. This is why you do research about stuff you want to sound off about. Speaking of which, hey Marvel, where's her movie? You might as well do it, people seem to care. Everybody's mad at you about Ant-Man, you gotta do something. Anyway, I'm Bob and that's the big picture.